A Pierce County family may finally have answers more than 3 decades after their loved one was found dead inside her home. Deputies arrested James Randall yesterday for the 1992 murder of his estranged wife, Janice Randall.
There is a particular architecture to the way a lie holds together over time. It requires, first, that the initial version be accepted without the scrutiny it deserves. It requires, second, that the case file which might have challenged the version be removed from active attention, reclassified, reduced, eventually purged, so that the lie has no document pressing against it. It requires, third, that the people who might have come forward, who knew something specific and difficult, either not come forward at all or come forward too slowly, too partially, too quietly to produce the consequence the truth was always capable of producing. And then time does the rest. Time moves the neighbors out. Time silences the witnesses. Time moves the case from the active desk to the storage cabinet, from the storage cabinet to the archive, from the archive to the category of things the system has technically not closed but has practically stopped pursuing. Time makes the lie look like the truth, simply because the lie has been standing in the truth's place for long enough that the distinction is no longer visible without someone willing to go looking for it. James Robert Randall understood this, whether he understood it in those terms or not. He understood it on the night of November 7th or 8th, 1992, when he went to his estranged wife's house in Graham, Washington, and killed her in her bedroom while their 18-month-old daughter slept in a crib nearby. He understood it when he told investigators the next day that his wife had a history of painkiller abuse and had probably overdosed. He understood it when the case was classified not as a homicide but as a death investigation, and then, for reasons the Pierce County Sheriff's Office would never be fully able to explain, was purged from the records. He understood that the story he had told, and the administrative decision that had followed it, and the passage of time that would follow the administrative decision, were together sufficient to make him invisible for the purposes of justice. He was right for 33 years. Then 2 daughters started making a spreadsheet. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you follow cold cases like this, liking the video really helps. Consider subscribing to the channel to help keep these stories alive. Now let's take a closer look at what happened to Janice Randall and the daughters who refused to let time finish the job their father had started. Graham, Washington sits in Pierce County in the Puget Sound region, roughly 20 miles south of Tacoma, in the foothills country between the city and the flanks of Mount Rainier. It is not an incorporated city, it is a census-designated place, an administrative geography, a community that has a character without a downtown, that registers itself in the landscape through its residential streets and its rural properties and the modest commercial development along the main corridors, without ever resolving into the kind of defined center that makes a place legible to outsiders. It is the kind of community where people live rather than visit, where the population is made up of people who have made a practical calculation about proximity to the city and land prices and the specific qualities of a place where you can have a yard and know your neighbors and not be crowded, without fully leaving behind the infrastructure that requires. In the early 1990s, it was growing in the way that the suburban periphery of every major Pacific Northwest city was growing, absorbing people and families from Tacoma and Seattle who were looking for something more spacious, more affordable, more removed from the density that the cities were accumulating. Janice Randall was 40 years old in the fall of 1992. She was the kind of person her daughter Katie Wakin would later describe in terms that resisted easy summarization, because the person they were describing was too specific and too vivid to fit comfortably in any of the conventional categories people use when they talk about those they have lost. Janice loved music and old movies. She could recite Singin' in the Rain from memory because she and Katie had watched it so many times together that the words had simply deposited themselves in both of them the way the words of Things You Love always do. She danced in the kitchen while she cooked, specifically to Janis Joplin, specifically to Piece of My Heart, the raspy, unsentimental wail of it filling the house while the spaghetti sauce went on the stove. She was a social butterfly, her daughter said, the person around whom friends organized themselves, who knew everyone and kept everyone connected in the way that some people do without seeming to try, who was described at her own funeral as the group's Rolodex, as social media before social media. She gave a piece of her heart to everyone she knew. She had 2 daughters. Katie was 14 in November 1992, from Janice's prior relationship. Courtney was 18 months old, in a crib in the bedroom where her mother was killed, where she would remain for 14 hours after her mother's death before anyone found them, crying, diaper full, beside a body she was too young to understand and not too young to need. The image of the 18-month-old in the crib next to the body is the image that Courtney Lewis, her adult name, would carry into her 30s, without fully processing until she had a toddler of her own and watched her child's face when she left the room, and understood for the first time, in the visceral and irreversible way of parenthood, that she had been that child, that it had happened to her, that this was part of her story and she needed to figure it out. The marriage between Janice and James Randall had been 5 years of something that the court records describe with the careful, compressed language of legal documentation, and that the full surrounding circumstances described with considerably less ambiguity. James Randall had a prior domestic violence conviction. He and Janice had separated weeks before her death, specifically in the aftermath of a domestic violence incident on October 1st, 1992, just 5 weeks before she was found dead, for which he was later convicted. The couple was in the middle of a divorce. They were locked in a custody battle over Courtney, who at 18 months was the center of a legal dispute in which Janice had sought full custody with supervised visits for James, and in which James, 4 days before Janice's body was found, had filed a countersuit seeking full custody for himself with limited visits for Janice. 4 days before she was found dead. The legal machinery of the custody battle, the formal expression of the conflict between them, had been put in motion in the most direct possible way just 4 days before the conflict resolved, in the bedroom of the house in Graham, into its permanent and violent conclusion. He had also made threats in the weeks leading up to her death. The court records note this. Threats? Prior conviction, domestic violence incident 5 weeks earlier, pending custody battle, with a countersuit filed 4 days before. These are not the ambient details of a marriage ending quietly. They are the specific, documented, date-stamped record of a situation that had been escalating, that people around Janice could see escalating, that she could feel escalating, and that the investigative infrastructure around it should have been equipped to register clearly as context for whatever happened in that bedroom in November 1992. Janice was found the next day. The condition of the bedroom told investigators what had happened before they asked a single question. A broken table, a smashed lamp, multiple bruises on Janice's body, signs of a struggle that were, in the words of an investigator present at the scene, obviously a homicide. The medical examiner noted the bruising. The investigator noted the obvious homicide. And then James Randall arrived and told them that his wife had a history of painkiller abuse, that she had probably just overdosed, that the bruising was something he couldn't account for, but that the drugs were the most likely explanation. The case was classified as a death investigation, not a homicide. A death investigation, the investigative category you open when you don't yet know whether a crime occurred, when the cause of death is genuinely ambiguous and requires determination before a criminal investigation can formally begin. The classification is not inherently wrong when there is genuine ambiguity. In this case, there was a broken table and a smashed lamp and multiple bruises and an investigator saying the word homicide out loud at the scene, and still the category was death investigation. The decision was made, and the case was organized around it. And the organizational decisions that follow from that classification are different from the decisions that follow from a homicide classification, and the difference mattered. The toxicology results came back. No drugs in Janice Randall's system, none. No evidence of the painkiller history that James Randall had cited to explain her death. The overdose narrative, which had been the stated rationale for the initial classification, had been definitively disproven. The case should have been reclassified immediately and aggressively as a homicide investigation with a prime suspect whose name was already in the file, whose history of domestic violence against the victim was already documented, whose custody countersuit had been filed 4 days before her death. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as undetermined pending additional investigation, not homicide, undetermined. And then the case, for reasons the Pierce County Sheriff's Office would acknowledge, decades later, that it could not fully explain, was eventually purged. Original reports, booked evidence, the physical and documentary record that an active homicide investigation would have preserved were destroyed, not misplaced, not lost to disorganization, purged. What survived was partial, scene photographs, a polygraph report, medical examiner records. Breadcrumbs, the sheriff's office said. Only breadcrumbs of information could be pieced together, with nothing substantial to establish probable cause for an arrest. What happened to this case in the 1990s is the specific institutional failure this story asks us to look at directly, not the dramatic failure of a single corrupt decision-maker, the quiet, procedural failure of a case that was never given the classification that would have protected it, never treated as the thing the evidence at the scene said it was, and that consequently entered the decade without the armor of a full homicide investigation. In the 1990s, witnesses moved away. Memories softened. The neighbor who saw the man on a bicycle grew older. The family members who had heard James Randall's private acknowledgments carried those acknowledgments inside their private lives. The investigative thread that had always been there had always been visible in the specific, if fragmentary, record of the October domestic violence incident and the November custody countersuit, and the bruised body and the broken furniture went unexamined because the file that contained it was classified as the wrong thing and then partially destroyed. There was no DNA in a national database to query. There was no centralized domestic violence registry that would have flagged James Randall's prior conviction automatically when his wife turned up dead. There were breadcrumbs, and no one was assigned to follow them. And time moved on the way time does when a case has been categorized as something less than what it was. The man who had been convicted of domestic violence against his wife, who had filed a custody countersuit 4 days before she was found with bruises and a broken table in her bedroom, who had told investigators she probably overdosed when there were no drugs in her system, continued his life. He was not arrested. He was not charged. The case drifted and then was purged, and then the breadcrumbs that remained sat in the reduced archive of a case that the system had technically not closed and had practically, functionally, administratively abandoned. Courtney Lewis grew up knowing her mother mostly through the version of Janice that her father offered her. This is one of the quieter cruelties of her situation, embedded inside the larger ones, that the person primarily responsible for what she knew of her mother was the person investigators now believe killed her mother, so that the portrait of Janice that Courtney carried through childhood was painted by the hand most invested in the painting being incomplete. She grew up in her father's house, then briefly with Katie's family in high school when she needed stability, then into her own adult life, building the health and wellness practice she now runs, marrying, having children, staying close to Katie across the years and the moves and the ordinary accumulation of adult life that tends to separate siblings, but didn't separate them because they had this thing in common, this motherlessness, this shared absence that bonded them even when they couldn't speak about it directly. Katie had suspected for years. She had reviewed case files in her 20s, had found things that troubled her, had made a decision that she held for a long time with the specific discipline of someone who has decided that a relationship she loves is worth protecting at the cost of a question she needs answered. She loved Lewis more than she needed answers. She had said that to herself. She had said it enough times to make it a position, a considered, sustained position, the position of a person who has genuinely weighed two things against each other and made a choice. And then one day in February 2025, on a walk in a park, she took a deep breath and ripped off the bandage. Lewis's response surprised her. Lewis had been quietly doing her own review. She had been requesting records, police records, medical examiner records, court documents, and reading them and building, alone and in private, a picture of what those records said had happened in November 1992. She had been making notes. She had been finding inconsistencies. She had been discovering things about her parents' marriage, about the weeks leading up to her mother's death, about the competing narratives in the investigative file that had been reshaping the picture she had always carried without her quite being able to tell Katie what she was doing, because telling Katie would have made it real in a different way. The two sisters went home from that walk in the park and started a spreadsheet. It became, in Katie's words, their obsession for the rest of the spring and summer of 2025. Every document they could find, every inconsistency logged, every date cross-referenced with every other date. The October 1st domestic violence incident, the November 3rd custody countersuit, the November 7th death, the toxicology results that showed no drugs, the medical examiner's undetermined finding, the purged original records, a neighbor who had reported seeing a man on a bicycle near Janice's house around the time of her death, a family member who had told investigators that James Randall had admitted going to Janice's home on a bicycle that night, a prosecutor's document stating that James Randall had confessed to two family members that he killed his wife, the confessions. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. In the 33 years between November 1992 and April 2026, James Randall had told people, family members, people close enough to have been trusted with something, that he had killed Janice. Not to investigators, not in any setting where it could be formally recorded or used in a proceeding, to family members, in the way that people sometimes say things in the register of private acknowledgement that they would never say in public. in the register of things that are carried between people who know each other and have decided, consciously or not, that what they know will stay between them. It had stayed. For 33 years it had stayed. And then the daughters asked the right people the right questions, and it didn't stay anymore. Katie and Lewis brought what they had found to the Pierce County Sheriff's Office. A detective received them, took what they had provided seriously, told them to be patient, stayed in contact, and worked the case. Last June, the detective told them the case was under active review. 8 months later, she called them both on a three-way phone call and told them an arrest had been made. On April 1st, 2026, a date chosen by the calendar and not by anyone's sense of irony, Pierce County Sheriff's deputies drove to a nursing home in Everett, Washington, where James Robert Randall, 68 years old and living in a care facility, had been residing. The body camera footage released by the sheriff's office shows the moment of arrest. He appears caught off guard. He asks, "What's this about?" as the officers handcuff him. The question, if it was genuine, would be extraordinary. 33 years of living with what he had done. 2 confessions to family members, and what's this about, and it may not have been genuine. It may have been the question a person asks when they have been waiting for a moment, and have prepared for a moment, and the moment has finally arrived and the preparation has been what it always is, insufficient. He was booked into the Pierce County Jail on a charge of first-degree murder. Bail was set at $1 million. He pleaded not guilty. Courtney Lewis found out when her phone rang as she was preparing to leave for work. The detective was on the line. Katie was on the line. They had done it, and the doing of it had 2 thoughts arriving at once in Lewis's mind, one after the other in the same breath. We did it, and oh my gosh, what did we do? Both thoughts are true. They are not contradictory. They are the simultaneous experience of a person whose grief has been organized around a crime for her entire conscious life, and who has now done the thing that resolves the crime and loses the father in the same motion. My heart sunk, she said. My hands were shaking. Nothing could have truly prepared me. She had grown close to her father. She had been a daddy's girl. She had understood her family history through the lens of what James Randall had told her, which meant through the lens of the man who killed her mother, which means her entire understanding of where she came from had been shaped by the very person whose version of events she was now dismantling. The process of investigating her mother's death had required her, as a parallel act, to investigate her own understanding of herself. She had been 34 when she started digging seriously, the same age James Randall had been when Janice died, a parallel she noticed and held. She had a toddler the same age she had been in the crib. The geometry of it, the way her own life had mirrored the life that had been taken from her in those specific measurements, was not lost on her. She cut ties with her father once she knew too much. She said, "It felt fake to have a relationship with him, knowing what I was doing." She said, "I couldn't sweep this under the rug," she said. "I chose to do something about it, even though I loved him very much." The past tense is precise and deliberate. Loved, not love, though the feeling has not entirely disappeared. She said she still struggles with questions about whether to write him a letter, whether to put money on his books, that the little girl inside her still wants the connection. But the little girl inside her and the woman she is have made different decisions. And the woman's decision was to call the Pierce County Sheriff's Office and ask them to take another look. Katie Waken stood outside a Tacoma courtroom after James Randall's arraignment and said, "I don't want to say I gave up hope, but I never thought I would see this in my lifetime," she said. "The blessing of having a lot of my mom's best friends fill in the gaps for us, as kids, because she was gone." The word blessing does a specific kind of work in that sentence. It is the word a person uses when they are trying to find the right relationship to a painful thing, to acknowledge that something insufficient was nonetheless real, that what was given in the absence of what should have been there was worth having, even though it was not what should have been there. Janice's friends had filled in the gaps. The gaps should never have existed. Both things are true. James Randall pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder. His trial date was set tentatively for May 20th, 2026. He is being held on $1 million bail. His attorney did not respond to press requests for comment. As of the time of this recording, the case is proceeding through the Pierce County legal system with the weight of 33 years of delayed reckoning behind it and the testimony of 2 daughters, one of whom was 14 when it happened and one of whom was in a crib and found out about it by becoming a mother herself. Waiting ahead of it, the Pierce County Sheriff's Office said, "This case stands as a powerful example of how advancements in technology and investigative practices can bring justice, even decades later." They said, "Most importantly, It is a testament to the unwavering commitment of the detectives and investigators who refused to let Janice's story be forgotten. Both of those sentences are accurate, and neither of them quite captures what actually happened, which was that the system had forgotten Janice's story, or had come close enough to forgetting it that only breadcrumbs remained, and that what refused to let her story be forgotten was not primarily the system, but two women who grew up without their mother and eventually decided that the questions they had been not asking for decades needed to be asked out loud. The oldest daughter, who remembered her mother dancing to Janis Joplin in the kitchen and made a choice for years to love her sister more than she needed answers. The youngest daughter, who was in a crib for 14 hours beside a body, who grew up knowing her family history through her father's version of it, who became a mother herself and understood for the first time what she had lost, who at 34 looked at her own child and understood the parallel and decided she could not sweep this under the rug. They asked, they dug. They made a spreadsheet, they requested documents, they found the inconsistencies, they took what they found to a detective who took them seriously. The system hadn't solved this. The daughters had. The system had provided the mechanism, a detective, a court, a charge, an arrest, but the activation of that mechanism, after 33 years of dormancy, came from two women who had been shaped by this crime for their entire lives and who decided, in a park in February 2025, that the shaping had gone on long enough without an accounting. Janice Randall was 40 years old in November 1992. She danced to Janis Joplin in the kitchen. She watched old movies with her daughter until they both knew the words. She was the group's Rolodex, the person who held everyone together, the person whose funeral friends attended, and said she was social media before social media. She gave a piece of her heart to everyone she knew. She was in a custody battle over an 18-month-old daughter. She had separated from a man with a domestic violence conviction weeks before she died. She had sought supervised visits for him. She had been, in the weeks before November 7th, trying to build the structure of a life that protected her child from someone she had recognized as a danger. She was trying to protect Courtney. She had not been able to protect herself. The case that carries her name, State of Washington versus James Robert Randall, is proceeding in Pierce County Superior Court. The man who told investigators she had probably overdosed and who was believed for 33 years is 68 years old and living in a nursing home in Everett and has pleaded not guilty. His daughters, one of whom was in the room when it happened and one of whom has spent her adult life looking at case files and protecting her sister from what the case files said, are preparing to be witnesses at his trial. The Pierce County Sheriff's Office detective who worked the case after the sisters came forward, who stayed in touch across months of waiting, who made the three-way phone call in early 2026 that told them an arrest had been made, has not been named publicly. She is the person who received what the daughters brought and knew what to do with it, who did the reinvestigation with the tools that 2025 offered that 1992 had not, who took the breadcrumbs and made them into something. The breadcrumbs were always there. The broken table was there. The smashed lamp was there. The bruises were there. The toxicology was there. The domestic violence conviction was there. The custody countersuit filed 4 days before the death was there. The investigator who said obviously a homicide was there. The confession to family members was there, carried for 33 years by people who eventually told the right person. What had been missing was someone willing to press on all of it at once. Two daughters built a spreadsheet. A detective answered the phone. And in a nursing home in Everett, Washington, on the first day of April 2026, a man who had been waiting 33 years for this moment or not waiting for it, who had either been afraid every day or comfortable every day, found out that the lie that had held for 3 decades had not held after all. Courtney Lewis said, "I went from being a daddy's girl to becoming Jan's daughter, and this is the first time in my life I've gotten to experience that." It is the most precise thing anyone has said about this case. Not the technical language of the charge, not the procedural language of the investigation. The experience of a woman in her mid-30s discovering, in the act of seeking justice for her murdered mother, that she is her mother's daughter, that she has access now to a parent she was prevented from knowing, that the process of dismantling the version of her history she had been given has opened into a different version, one in which Janice Randall cooks spaghetti sauce and dances to Piece of My Heart and gives a piece of her heart to everyone she knows, including the daughter she was separated from when that daughter was 18 months old, and the separation was not of her choosing or Janice's choosing, but of the choice made in a bedroom in Graham, Washington, on a November night in 1992. She gets to be Jan's daughter now. The trial will determine what comes next for the man in the nursing home. Janice deserved better than what happened to her. Her daughters refused to let time make it permanent. That refusal is what this case will ultimately be remembered for, and it belongs to them. The case of State of Washington versus James Robert Randall, charged with first-degree murder in the November 1992 death of Janice Randall, is pending in Pierce County Superior Court as of the date of this recording. James Robert Randall has pleaded not guilty. He is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.